Perfect. Yeah, this is Ishan Kamat. I'm one of the Advanced Heart Failure and Transplant Cardiology Fellows, and it's my honor to introduce Dr. William Cohn, Billy Cohn, for our talk today. Just to go through his background, he's the director of Center for Device Innovation at the Texas Medical Center, a professor of surgery at Baylor College of Medicine, and an adjunct professor at Bioengineering at Rice University and at the University of Houston and Texas A&M. But prior to joining the TMC, he was also a vice president and executive director for the Johnson Johnson Center for Device Innovation at TMC, and then director of the Center for Technology Innovation and director of the renowned Cullen Cardiovascular Research Laboratory at the Texas Art Institute. He's widely known for his contributions to development of the continuous flow, totally implantable artificial heart. And in 2011, Dr. Cohn and Dr. Bud Frazier implanted the first pulseless total artificial replacement heart in a human patient. He's been granted more than 200 patents or patents pending, which have provided the core technology for 6 venture-backed medical device startups. So in addition to being a cardiothoracic surgeon and a serial med device innovator and entrepreneur, as some of you know in the audience there, he is a master of close-up magic. He's also a musician and plays at the local bar in Houston. So swing through anytime you're there. And then he's a dear, steadfast mentor of mine it seems like 10, 12 years ago, where he first kind of lit the fire under my career interest in heart failure and medical device innovation as well. So y'all are in for a real treat. And I bet you by the end of this talk, a lot of you will be changing your careers as well. So without further ado, Dr. Cohn on the past, present, future of the total artificial heart.
Thank you, Sean. That was a great introduction, and congratulations on your child yesterday. That's wonderful. So I'm so delighted to be here, standing on the shoulders of giants who stood on the shoulders of giants to tell you what the future of heart failure management is, and it's becoming clearer and clearer with every day. Special shout outs to Bud Frazier, my partner, and Daniel Timms, one of the most brilliant individuals I've ever had the good fortune to work with. And I'm going to tell you what's going on with the total artificial heart. And this is a very Houston-centric story. So you guys in California may go, maybe not, but I'll convince you that it is. So here's my disclosure. I'm going to try hard to maintain equipoise, but I'm a cheerleader for the technology. So I encourage you to listen with the appropriate filters in place. You all know heart failure is a big deal. I'm not going to go into this. It's the #1 cause of death in most demographics. We spend a fortune on patients slowly dying of heart failure, and it affects every one of us, every family, everybody. Why don't we just transplant them all? We just don't have the organs. The busiest transplant year we ever had was last year in the United States, 4,169 transplants. It's because Transmedics, another organ in a box, allowed us to keep hearts longer and allocate them better. Donation after cardiac death. I didn't think there was much future in that, but boy, is it taken off. The opioid crisis tragically made a lot more donors. We now can use hepatitis C donors. All those things conspired to make 4,169 transplants. This year is going to be a little less, but a drop in the bucket compared to the 160,000 Americans that are going to die of heart failure this year. In fact, 400,000 Americans, heart failure is a contributing factor on the death certificate. What are we going to do about this? Well, the idea of making an artificial heart is not a new one. How many of you know this name, Michael DeBakey? I was his last chief resident. He used to hit me in the chest in the operating room. Sweet man. He paid Cleveland Clinic the ultimate compliment and stole Domingo Leota from them. He was an Argentinian who had an idea for an artificial heart. Domingo Leota started working on this device, and then DeBakey hired Denton Cooley, a name that some of you may know, from Johns Hopkins, and he became his protege. Domingo Leota was frustrated that it was taking so long to get into humans. DeBakey had done 7 cows. The longest one went 12 hours. Domingo said to Dr. Cooley, I think we're ready for humans. I think cows are harder than humans. And he was right. Cows are a lot harder than humans. And Dr. Cooley said, well, why don't you bring one over here across the street to Texas Heart Institute? He'd started a couple of years earlier just for overflow because he was doing so much heart surgery. By cover of night, Domingo Leota brought a duplicate system over. Walt DeBakey was in Washington, D.C. getting additional funding for the project. Here he is with LBJ. Dr. Cooley famously implanted it in a patient. This is Haskell Karp, 46-year-old with ischemic cardiomyopathy. The whole half of his left ventricle was scar. He realized that if he cut it out and replaced it with Dacron, he wouldn't come off bypass. Cooley consented him to put that artificial heart in. He predicted it correctly at the end of the operation. There was no way he was making it out of the OR. They sewed the Leota heart in. Here he is, first postoperative day, extubated. This big Zamboni thing is what's providing the compressed air to actuate the device. Tragically, after 64 hours, he was hemolyzing so badly, it put him in renal failure. They listed him and did a transplant. This is before they had good immunosuppression. This is April 4th, 1969. He died 32 hours later. So although it wasn't a successful outcome, it was the first time a human had been supported by an artificial heart. Dr. DeBakey looked at this as a personal attack, that Cooley stole the legacy of putting in the first artificial heart, came back, fired Cooley, fired everybody in the lab. They all ran over to Texas Heart. And for the next 40 years, these two great men never spoke a word. And their hospitals were separated by a parking lot. And throughout the 80s, the two of them in combination did more heart surgery than was done in all of Europe. The device used two air bladders that were inflated by compressed air. When they inflated, they forced the blood out. When they deflated, the devices, the pump would fill with blood again. Your heart's two pumps, of course. There's a left balloon, a right balloon, and it would inflate and deflate 100 times a minute to produce like 5.5 liters of blood. That original device is in the Smithsonian Institute. If you ever go there, you can visit Haskell Karp's artificial heart, but its descendant is still around today. It's called the Syncardia. Are you guys a Syncardia site? You do more than 2 a year? That's perfect. It's a brilliant device, though. It is a brilliant device. First of all, the Jarvik 7 in the 80s, that was a descendant of that then became the Symbion, the CardioWest, the same team, better materials, better manufacturing. It's now called the Syncardia, and it's a temporary device. Why? Well, you have two air hoses coming out of your body, which some centers can make that work and have reasonable infection rates. Most centers report 70% air hose infection in the first year. You have this box with pistons going up and down. It's loud. It weighs 13 pounds. You've got it strapped to your back, but maybe it beats dying from heart failure. And because it has cyclic fatigue, you have to change that box out every 3 months. The worst thing, though, is this. It fails capriciously. And does it fail at a year or 2 years or 3 years? It's random. Nobody knows. But if it's beating 100 times a minute, that's 144,000 heartbeats every day. That's 52 million heartbeats in a year. No man-made device can do that without failing. So this is a great device to keep many patients alive until they get a transplant. But the average time this is in somebody's chest is about 90 days. Some centers like Banner keep them in longer, but they are the uber domain experts in this. One patient has gone 7 years on the device. We had two that went 4 years before they died when their devices failed. It's a noisy device. It's easy to put in, but it's really just going to be a temporary means until you can find a donor heart. How many of you remember this? This is the Abiacor. Abiomed of Impella fame, now a Johnson Johnson company, spent $250 million designing this pump without an external driver. Electricity caused silicon oil to go back and forth, but still flexible membranes, still valves opening and closing, 52 million heartbeats a year. They weren't very optimistic about durability, and they were correct. They all failed. They all broke. My partner, Bud Frazier, did 150 of the animals required before they put these in humans. Of the 14 patients, we did 5 of them at Texas Heart. Rob Dowling and Layman Gray did 7 of them at Louisville. only 4 of the patients live longer than 9 months. All the devices broke. That kind of cyclic fatigue, 24 hours a day, no man-made device can do it. And a lot of patients had strokes and infections. It was too big. It used a lot of power, 38 watts, limited flow. It could only do about 8.5 liters. It was hard to balance the left and right, but the limited durability is what really made everybody realize this isn't going to happen. The FDA, after those first 14, said you can do 20 more. Abiomed made a business decision and shut down the program in 2004. So in 2004, it looked like we weren't going to have an artificial heart anytime soon. That said, there are some cool projects still going. How many of you know about the CARMAT device in Europe? It's just like the Abiomed AbioCor, the one that I just showed you, but the inner surfaces are lined with pericardium. It uses pericardial valves. Maybe the mechanism is a little better. We wish them well. It's a complex device, a lot of moving parts. They're doing about 1 a week now in Europe. They tried to start a program here in the United States, but after 3 patients, 2 of the patients died at 3.5 months when their device broke, and the FDA said, that's it, your EFS is over, back to the drawing board. Of the first 40 patients, 13 of them, a third of them, died when their pumps broke at 3 months. But apparently they've gotten beyond there. The mechanical failures seem to be doing better. I think they've done 73 implants when I last heard. I wish them well, but a large, complex device, a lot of moving parts with limited output and limited durability, and it's big. There's Piet Jensen is a chief medical officer of CARMAT. There are a couple other pumps that we wish them well, but they're complex and have a lot of moving parts. So right now, it doesn't sound like the future of the artificial heart is very rosy, does it? Well, I'll get back to that in a second, because I'm going to talk about LVADs. When everybody was having problems with artificial hearts, a lot of people said, including DeBakey, artificial hearts are just going to be too challenging. Let's just support the left heart. You guys are all familiar with left ventricular assist devices, right? The first ones were the HeartMate 1. And just like World War I, they didn't call it the HeartMate 1. They thought it was the HeartMate. They thought it was and you guys probably put those in here, didn't you? I know George did. This was the XVE. This was the first commercially successful one. It was a big can. It beat 100 times a minute with a pusher plate going back and forth. It had inlet and outlet valves, so it had a very limited durability as well. But it would keep a patient alive. You could take a patient who was in profound heart failure with blue lips and uric, their lungs are filling with fluid, put this in them. If they survived the operation, it's a big device. It was a big operation. And if they survived the rehab, several weeks to get up and walking, then they would do so much better. And they were great transplant candidates, but at 18 months, they would start making weird noises. That was the titanium bearings giving out. If you didn't transplant them, they would die when their device failed. But that was the rematch trial, showed us that pumps could save lives. Big, big device, so big operation to put it in. But the thing that got it was the cyclic durability. The device would break after about 18 months. That's what Rich Wampler was thinking about when he was in Egypt on a missionary trip and saw 2 Egyptians use a shot off to pump water up a riverbank for irrigation. And a shot off is just a long Archimedes screw. You rotate it and it pulls water against gravity like an escalator. And Rich Wampler, we call him Captain Hemo, one of the most brilliant engineers you'll ever meet. And actually, he's a doctor as well. He did half of an ER residency and then quit. Said, if that can move water against gravity, maybe it can move blood against pressure. So he designed this insane device. It was a tube about as big around as your pinky finger that would go across the aortic valve. This is the 1980s. There were no motors small enough or powerful enough to spin an impeller that would fit in this thing fast enough. The impeller sat right here. It was about the size of a pencil eraser. It had to spin 27,000 times a minute. No motors that big now. But back then, there are now. That's what the Impella is. The Impella is a direct descendant of this. So Rich said, I'll have the motor outside the body, strapped to the patient's thigh, and I'll have a spinning cable in a tube running up the femoral artery, up the aorta, around the arch to this little motor. And he went and showed Dr. Frazier this, and Dr. Frazier said, "Well, that's the craziest thing I've ever seen. Let's try it." Dr. Frazier wondered why it wasn't going to destroy red blood cells. But Rich explained to him that it's like running your hand through the flame of a candle. Your hand will just see the flame for a second and then have plenty of time to cool off. Frazier did cow after cow after cow, and amazingly, it didn't destroy the red blood cells that badly. And so they waited for the right patient. It was this gentleman from Cranach who came back 6 months after a heart transplant in acute rejection. His lips were blue. He was anuric. His lungs had filled with fluid. They took him to the operating room, slid that device up his femoral artery under X-ray, put the tube across the aortic valve, turned it on. With the flow it produced, while they were watching, his lips went from blue to pink. He started making gallons of urine. His chest X-ray cleared up over the next day. At 48 hours, his cable broke. But by then, they'd gotten his heart beating. They used OKT3, a new way to treat humoral rejection at the time. He stayed in the hospital for 8 days, went home, lived another decade. First human being to have a rapidly spinning thing inside his body. They had a press conference kind of like this to describe this. All the major newspapers and news outlets were there. Someone in the back raised their hand. And Dr. Frazier said, yes. He said, Dr. Frazier, why doesn't it break up the blood? And Dr. Frazier said, you see, it's like run your hand through the flame of a candle. And he explained to everybody that it spun 2,700 times a minute. Everybody was amazed. Everybody left. Rich Wampler comes up afterwards and says, Dr. Frazier, great job. No, thanks, Rich. A bit of a curveball. He goes, yeah, one correction. You said it spins 2,700 times a minute. It's actually 27,000 times a minute. And Dr. Frazier apparently looked at his shoes and said, well, it's a good thing I didn't know that. I never would have tried it. Anyway, true story. Bud says, I never said that. Rich said, yes, he did. Anyway, Rob Jarvik. You all know Rob Jarvik of the Jarvik fame, the Jarvik 7, Barney Clark. He shifted his focus to rapidly spinning turbines. He had the first rapidly spinning LVAD. It was a turbine about the size of your thumb. It would actually go in the left ventricular apex. First case was done in England because of regulatory things by Steve Westerby, but Bud Frazier went over there and helped him with that case. That patient lived 7.5 years with that device. It didn't wear out. He actually died of a nosebleed, the transfusion that put him in renal failure. He had the misfortune of having 2 wives because he'd been divorced, and they argued about whether they should dialyze him or not, and he died while they were deciding. So rapidly spinning turbines, as you know, this is the HeartMate 2, have only one moving part. And if you design them properly, they don't tear up the blood. And blood comes in through here, hits this, gets accelerated, the flow gets straightened out and it gets turned from swirl into pressure and linear flow. This has magnets in it. These are microprocessor commutated electromagnets, which make it spin. This was the HeartMate 2. It had a ruby bearing on both ends supporting this. Now the new spinning pumps don't even have that. They're magnetically levitated. The first successful Thortec HeartMate 2 was done at the Texas Heart Institute 2 months after I came back down from Boston and joined Bud Frazier. I didn't have my tickets yet, so I was at the head of the bed while Igor and Bud put it in. A 17-year-old boy, Everardo Flores. Look how much smaller it is than the big Pulsatile devices. It uses a lot less energy. It's much more robust. There's now a patient that Walt Dembitsky has in San Diego that's approaching 21 years on a single HeartMate 2. They never wear out. But patients still have complications, and it's the pump body interface. The bypass left ventricle sometimes forms clot in the left atrium. The right heart fails. But these pumps are durable. There's 1,000 patients that have had a HeartMate 2 for over 12 years. And that HeartMate 2 is now obsolete because it's been replaced by a better device, the HeartMate 3. We did all the GLPs for this at Texas Heart. There's the Jarvik, there's the Everhart. Guess what? Almost all the pumps in this picture are obsolete and gone now. Still, that was back in 2003. That's when Bud Frazier said, come down here and help me rethink the total artificial heart. And I thought, what a great opportunity working with Bud Frazier. I'd sort of established myself as an innovator in the field. I'd started a couple companies, invented a couple products. I moved my family back from Boston to Houston. As I mentioned, all these are gone, but there's a bunch more now that are in various stages of clinical and preclinical work. So I came down to Houston, and the first thing we did is ask Rob Jarvik for two of his turbines. These things were $75,000 each, but we'd done all the GLP animal work at Texas Heart. All his training programs were there. I think he felt like he needed to support us, so he gave us these. We took a cow, we went on cardiopulmonary bypass, cut its heart out completely, put one of the turbines, you can't see the turbine, but there it is, crammed in the right atrial remnant after cutting out the heart. Here's a second one in the left atrial remnant. It's sewed end to end to the aorta, and this one sewed end to end to the pulmonary artery. We didn't have a lot of confidence that this was going to be doable, but it was a neat experiment. We got this cool X-ray post-op showing flow through the pulmonary artery and then coming back and going out the aorta. I went back up to my office to check my email. He was dry and stable. I said, take him to the ICU. Let's see what happens. I get an excited call 4 hours later to come down to the lab, and there's that animal. He woke up, he stood up, he's eating hay, he's got no heartbeat, no pulse. His heart has only two moving parts. You see, we named him the Tin Man. Shout out to the Wizard of Oz. And that animal went 21 days and actually died when it stood up and knocked the right controller off and it unplugged. He went into modified tetralogy, modified Fontan circulation for a second there, but pulling blood with the left pump. His lungs whited out and he died hours later. But anyway, what an amazing experience. And we wanted to do this over and over again. And we kept using those same turbines and they got really gross. And we injured the drive line, taking one out. And Rob Jarvik was generous, but not that generous. He wasn't going to give us an infinite supply of these. Luckily, Michael DeBakey had started his own continuous flow pump company in Houston, working with engineers in NASA. It was called Micromed, then changed its name to Reliant. Well, I approached them and said, I'm going to be your chief medical officer. And they said, great. In return, I got free pumps. And so we started doing a lot of these animals with pairs of these. But this wasn't a nice bullet that you could put in the left and right atrium. We need to make adapters. And so I remember Michael DeBakey, my chairman and who was head of the department when I graduated. He took Dacron and showed us that you could replace blood vessels with Dacron. So I went and got some Dacron at the fabric store. I made a little pattern so I could sew these into a perfect cone, C-O-N-E cone, that I would put over these styrofoam mandrels. And then I went to medical device prototyping headquarters and bought drywall tape. That's the stuff you put on the seams between the drywall so you can paint over it and it doesn't look bad. And bath and tile caulk, that's the stuff you use to keep the upstairs toilet from draining on the stove downstairs in the kitchen, and made these piñatas, multiple layers of drywall tape embedded with silicone. And so you could cut them in the OR and they wouldn't fray. You could sew through them and the needle holes wouldn't bleed or tear because of the mesh. And inside was a beautiful layer of Dacron polyester that Dr. DeBakey had taught us you could put in the cardiovascular system. And with those, I would go into the OR, cut out the heart of a cow on cardiopulmonary bypass. So one of these to the right atrial remnant, and you see I have pressure lines on them at this stage. We're still figuring it out. Put a turbine on there. There's a second one going to the left atrial remnant, a second turbine, crossing them so the left turbine could get to the aorta and the right atrium could get to the pulmonary artery. And there's that animal 7 weeks later, walking on a treadmill. There's the legendary Denton Cooley, Bud Frazier. I'm over here holding the molasses. We thought, wow, this is really exciting. And we were able to get money, grants, and additional support to do this over and over again. Here's our twin turbine heart. Here's the AbioCore, much, much smaller, only two moving parts, should be much more durable. There we started doing it with HeartMate 3s, with HeartWares. In fact, here's a breakdown of 8 years worth of work. The first 68 of these that we had done, most of them were with micromeds because we had such good access to them, and it was a pretty cool pump. But based on this and our results, we had some cool observations. We had flow probes so we could measure output on the left and right. We had 30 of the animals that made it more than a week. We were able to put eight of them on the treadmill. Only 3 of them made it to 90 days. We could get about 10 liters of cardiac output, but we had 2 computers and we're always fiddling with them. These pumps, these rapidly spinning pumps, if you provide more blood to them, they pump more. So there was a degree of automaticity, but we were having to adjust them a lot. And right thrombus was a problem. We all develop clots in our veins. They break loose. They go through our right heart. Our lung filters them out. We get a pain in our side. You do okay with that. If your right pump is a turbine, one little clot can take it out. And that's why twin HeartMate 3s has not been a very successful intervention. The pumps on the right are super susceptible to thrombus. Here's a dual micromed using a different configuration, and there's thrombus in the right. A third of our animals, that's what would kill them, was thrombus going in the right pump. Still, it was a lot smaller than any other artificial heart. It used a lot less power. It should be more durable. And only working with Bud Frazier would you have the opportunity. And Bud said, maybe we should try this in a patient. And with the cover he provided and making sure we were ethical in selecting a patient, we decided to do it. That said, we both knew if we sewed drywall tape and bath and tile caulk into a patient, we would go to prison. But there were things on the shelves of Texas Heart Institute that were approved for human implantation that could replace those. Specifically, instead of a $6 for a 25-yard roll of drywall tape, I used a $2,000 sheet of hernia mesh. Instead of Dacron polyester from the fabric store, I use Bard cardiovascular patches, and then NuSil medical silicone. And with those things, made the world's first continuous flow total artificial heart. And everything in this picture is approved for implantation in a human, perhaps not in that exact configuration. Because at the end of 2010, the HeartMate 2 was approved. And you can see there's a band tied too. I should have taken that out of the picture. Anyway, we did 2 cows with this exact configuration, showed it worked great, and then waited for our perfect patient. Had to be a patient that had no other options. And at the Texas Heart Institute, you don't have to wait long. A gentleman came in with advanced systemic amyloid. He was on dialysis. He was in liver failure. He was on ECMO and then got transitioned to a tandem, which is a left heart percutaneous assist. But there was nothing we could offer this guy. He was awake enough, and he was an engineer that we could explain what we were thinking, and he wanted to try it. His wife said he would love to try this because he was an engineer. Here's his chest x-ray, first postoperative day, 2 HeartMate 2s, this one going from the right atrial adapter made out of hernia mesh, going to the pulmonary artery. This one going right to the aorta. The aortic graft was 1 centimeter long. And he extubated the next day. He was still on dialysis. You can see how yellow he was. He went 5 weeks with this device. And actually, hemodynamically, was perfect throughout that period with no pulse and was actively engaging his family. But tragically, his transaminases and his ammonia continued to climb from his liver failure. He got to where he couldn't maintain wakefulness. We were hoping to get him strong and get him through some rehab and then maybe try a triple organ transplant, a heart, liver, kidney. But then he started having hemoptysis. We bronched him and found amyloid in his lung. And after some very difficult conversations, we decided to terminate, to let him die. And we got some great publications out of it. We got to give a TED talk in Lincoln Center. When I was little, subscribed to Popular Science. I just thought it was the coolest thing. I read every ad, every article. I said, I'm going to be a scientist. It's the first magazine I subscribed to. So getting the lay press and ending up on the cover of Popular Science, I thought, I'm done, man. I can go home and wait for a happy death. But the most important thing that came out of this is I met this guy. Daniel Timms had done his PhD while we were doing all those twin turbine animals. He had come up with the idea of making a single moving part, a double-sided rotor, while his dad was dying of congestive heart failure. Tragically, his dad died while he was still in his PhD, but he gave a talk in Paris about his idea. He'd never done a successful animal. Bud Frazier was in the audience and went up to the microphone. And when Bud Frazier goes to the microphone, it's usually a disaster for whoever's up there. Says, you don't know anything about what's been done in this field. But he went up there and everybody's going, oh, this poor kid, this PhD. And he says, well, I don't know what the future of this field is, but it's going to be something like this young man just showed. And Daniel was immediately a celebrity. Some of my guys were at this meeting in Paris, and they invited him to come down to Houston. I wasn't there, so he sat with me. And 6 hours into our 30-minute meeting, I was saying, you're bringing your whole team to Houston. What would that cost for us to make one of these? He said $2.5 million. I knocked on one door. Jim and Linda McInvale, they're successful furniture guys. They wrote us a check for $2.5 million a week later. We brought the whole team to Houston. Here was the original Bioengineering team into the lab. This is the device that emerged over the next 11 years. It's put in just like a heart transplant, 2 cuffs, 2 grafts that snap to the device. There's one moving part. This low, flat pinwheel takes the bright red blood returning from the lung and pumps it to the body. This clot-tolerant Stonehenge-looking thing takes the venous blood and pumps it to the lungs. One moving part. There's a liter per minute of shunt across the outside of this that keeps thrombus from getting into that gap or getting to the left side. This is a brushless DC motor that makes it spin. These 3 electromagnets pull the rotor up off that surface so it's magnetically levitated, and they're adjusting several thousand times a second based on input from eddy current sensors. It's easy to put in. It's robust. We've put this in cows and had them exercising on a treadmill with cardiac outputs just shy of 21 liters a minute. The cool thing about this device is we're leveraging the technology that's everywhere today. Specifically, it exists as a digital file. Why is that important? Because we can iterate on a daily basis using 3D printing. Why did we have to do that? Because there's something that we use in pump design called CFD, computational flow dynamics, that lets you sort of predict what the behavior is going to be. But it's only so-so. It comes down to actually testing. Well, are you going to test hundreds of versions of the pump? With 3D printing, you can. These are volutes. This is the housing that the thing rotates in. Teeny little differences in radiuses of curvature, or how axisymmetric is, or what the diameters of the inlet and outlets are, have a big difference in impact. You got to test them all. Here's the left outlet volute. Here's the right volute. So with 3D printing, we could print tons of impellers. All these may look the same. Nah, differences in radius of curvature or number of rotors or how tall they are. Similarly, you can see that some of the number, the degree of back sweeping, what the radius of curvature of the edge is. Tons and tons of versions. Well, we made a test rig that allowed us to test every impeller in every volute at every afterload at every RPM. And this is a micrometer. Our little impeller can move to the left or right and does that based on flow conditions. So we had to test every left impeller at every spacing. Why? Because different spacings create different efficiencies. This is how this balances the left and right flow. It's always up-regulating or down-regulating the left pump efficiency based on what's going on with atrial pressures and pulmonary vascular resistance. As a patient or an animal breathes, the left rotor moves back and forth to accommodate the change in resistance. This is how we could achieve those scientific results to pick our rotor. So here's the impeller. There, it's way to the right. There's a big gap here at the left. Now, the patient coughs. The impeller moves way over here or way over there. It's always sensing what's going on. And since it's looking several thousand times a second, a cough is a protracted glacial event that it can react to better than your own heart. So when the impeller moves to the left impeller becomes ferocious, super efficient. When it moves to the right and there's a big gap, it becomes kind of a weak impeller. We would plot, so this is for one impeller in one volute at different spacing and different pressure heads at one speed. So we generated just volumes of this and had a computer go through and pick what our best left behavior and best right behavior was. Here's right behavior. The right rotor, since it's those tall things, that little amount of shift doesn't matter at all. It's all upregulating or downregulating efficiency on the left. But if you think about it, if you start coughing a lot, your pulmonary vascular resistance goes way up, a lot less blood's going across. You better decrease the efficiency on the left or it'll suck down. Ours does it before you can even think about it. Here's a bunch of left rotors and right rotors. We realize that was our best right-sided impeller. That was our best left-sided impeller. We then printed a 3D plastic Bioengineering. Those are the 3 electromagnets that are adjusting several thousand times a second to keep the impeller straight. Those are the eddy current sensors. Here's the motor. There is the best right-sided impeller and the best left-sided impeller mounted on the magnets. There are 10 really strong magnets right under this surface and 2 magnetic rings just under this surface. The magnetic rings work with these 3 magnets to do the levitation and the shifting. The 10 magnets under here work with these 12 electromagnets to make it spin. Then we did something that showed a fair degree of hubris. After showing it worked great in a mock loop and that it didn't hemolyze, we actually sewed the 3D plastic printed heart into a cow. And here's a cow blissfully unaware that we printed his heart out of plastic on a printer the week before. Now, we could only go 3 to 5 days with these 3D printed plastic hearts because there were some very thin components and the plastic's hydroscopic. It soaks up water and warps, and these things have to be perfect. But it got us data to show how our device was going to work, and it allowed us to explore pulsatility. Do you need a pulse? Does everybody here have a pulse? Raise your hand if you don't have a pulse. No, every animal has a pulse, every mammal has a pulse, but every flying thing has flapping wings. And we showed that you don't need flapping wings to fly. If you look at the capillaries with confocal microscopy, no one's got a pulse in their capillaries. Gas exchange and end organ function was normal in all of our pulseless animals. But if you have a 70% carotid, there is an incidence of distal carotid thrombosis with decreased pulsatility. Pulsatility creates washout behind narrowed lesions. GI bleeding, 1/3 to 1/4 of patients with continuous flow VADs, if they've got decreased pulsatility, have that. We think it's related to von Willebrand consumption. And we know that pulsing arteries give off von Willebrand. And it's certainly going to make washout better. Maybe making a pulse is of merit. Well, this is a digital pulse. Pulses occur so much slower than our device is working. We can make any pulse you want. We now use a 900 RPM delta. We go 600 RPM above the stated speed and then 300 below it. So a 900 RPM delta, that gives us reliably a 40 millimeter pulse pressure that picks up on a pulse ox, gives you a palpable pulse, and a Dynamap can give you an accurate blood pressure reading. Here's a Bioengineering operating in pulsatile mode. You can see my thumb and fingers being popped apart by it. Animals with pulses did great. They didn't hemolyze. They didn't require more energy. How many of you would look at that arterial wave tracing and say, oh, it's a magnetically levitated spinning disc that you're spinning fast and slow? Looks like a regular art line, doesn't it? And the properties, the acceleration, the dp/dt is very analogous to what we all have. So now we felt we knew what we needed to make. We just needed to make it last longer. This is called SLS, selective laser sintering, metal dust melted into monolithic structures by a laser. It takes all night long, but the next morning we were able to brush off the titanium dust, and there rising like Venus from the mist was our first metal Bioengineering. We electropolished it, took it into the OR, Here it is, size-wise, next to the universal volumetric control, the Diet Coke. It still has a drive line, and the current one has a drive line too, but we got a plan for getting rid of that. Here we are in the OR doing our first durable implant. There's Rich Wampler, Captain Hemo. Here's Daniel Timms, Nick Graytrix, Matthias Kleinheier, Nobu, the whole team from Bivacor. This is before I joined them full time. But for 10 years, I did about 80 implants. I was still full-time faculty at Texas Heart Institute and Baylor College of Medicine. There's the device. I talk about Texas Heart Cardiovascular Research Lab with reverence. It is an amazing place. Here we are coming out of the OR. That's Kelly, who always rides with the animals in the stanchion. You know, it takes an amazing facility to do this kind of work. This is why Texas Heart Institute has been involved in the genesis of the Jarvik, the HeartMate 2, the HeartMate 3, the XVE, every durable pump. And we've done all the work here. And this is where we're training all the centers to put this in. Here's a Bivacor animal walking on a treadmill. Here's my favorite one. This one went 3 months. He put on 80 pounds of lean skeletal muscle with the Bivacor in a 96-day run, and his cardiac output went up to over 14 liters with exertion. We had one that I said went 21 liters and said, don't have a video of that. But we finished design for manufacturing. That's how are we going to make this? You can't use 3D metal in devices like this. The FDA won't let you. Someday they will. But we figured what 7 pieces to machine, what order to laser weld them into, how to polish it. So here's our progress to date. We did 40 chronic animals and presented that to the FDA. They said, okay, you need to do a GLP study. In GLP studies, we couldn't be involved. They agreed that a GLP light study where we're implanting it and taking care of the animals, but under GLP conditions. They said they wanted to see 5 animals in a row go 30 days. There are the 5 animals. We had a lot of infections because these animals have a drive line and they lie down in the same stanchion that they go to the bathroom in. But with infectious disease consults and everything we could do, we get them through. The FDA had some concerns about some pannus on suture lines and some infected animals. We had to go back into the previous 40 animals and come up with examples of animals that went long period, that didn't have infection, that didn't have pannus. Durability. This is a room at Huntington, in Huntington Beach, California, where the company is now located, that has 8 pumps that are now at 2.5 years without a failure. We have 2 of the older iterations of the pump that have pumped for 5 years without a failure. Here's our hemolysis data. We're now doing acquired von Willebrand data, which looks very, very good. So, you know, all the ducts are coming into a line. This is what the device looks like now. That's the controller and 2 batteries. Each of these batteries is 83 watt hours. We'll power the device for 4 hours. There's a third one in here, and that's with a cardiac output north of 10 liters. If you're 6 liters, this thing consumes 1 watt per liter per minute. There's a console that you can plug in that banks data and that programs the controller, but you don't have to carry that with you. Here's our plan. That's the device we have now. But the electronics that make the motor spin, that's called commutation, and the electronics that control the maglev will move from the driver into the actual can, into your chest. That's what they do with the HeartMate 3. All the electronics are in the can in the HeartMate 3. The driveline just contains power. That'll enable us to become very, very small, just batteries. And then once the driveline's that small, we get rid of it entirely, and you have an antenna, and you do inductive coupling, just like the thing you set your cell phone on to charge it wirelessly. Very easy. The technology exists. When we get to this, we think actually right around here is when we will become not just a bridge to transplant, but an attractive alternative to transplantation once we show that our durability is good and we have long-term results. Once we get to here, we think we will be much better than transplant. And instead of 1 in 40 patients who can benefit from them, perhaps all of them will. Here's progress to date. In November 17th, of last year, the FDA notified us that we could start our EFS, our early feasibility study in clinics. It is a monumental task to get ready for this. We had 10 sites. We had to train about 100 people at each site. The surgeons that were going to put it in, cardiologists that were going to manage them, anesthesiologists, perfusionists, critical care docs, nurses. They all came to Houston. We went to their sites. We did a couple more animals with each site. We did human cadavers. These were the first 4 sites to be activated: the Texas Heart Institute, Banner in Phoenix, Christ in Cincinnati, and Duke. And then in June, we finished clinical trial agreements, June of this year, and started putting patients in. The first patient was implanted at the Texas Heart Institute on July 9th, not that long ago. That patient went 8 days and then was transplanted and went home and did great. He was in profound heart failure. He was 11 kilos positive from right heart failure. When we put it in, he peed off all that weight. His creatinine and liver indices returned to normal. By day 7, he was walking 1/10 of a mile. We thought, oh man, we listened for transplant. Transplant went fine. Turned out it's just gotten better. Our second patient was done at Duke by Jacob Schroeder and Carmelo Milano. He was walking by post-op day 3 and was able to walk with cardiac outputs of 14 liters a minute, walking a mile a day effortlessly. And he was transplanted on day 10. He's home with his family as well. And I should say, this first EFS study, they can't leave the ICU. It's bridge to transplant. And because they can't leave the ICU and they've got mechanical support supporting both sides of their heart that precludes discharge, they all become status 1. When we post-list them, they get a donor organ right away. That's why all the durations have been so short. This next one, though, even with that, he was type O, he was 6'4", he had the device for 27 days. Again, his renal function, his GFR was 42 when we put the device in. By 2 days later, it was 105. His urine, his creatinine dropped from 1.8 to 0.7. His lungs cleared up. He was able to walk by day 4. He was walking 1.7 miles a day with a cardiac output of almost 14 liters a minute and was transplanted on post-op day 28. He's home with his family. Patient 4 done at Christ. Again, he was a hypertroph. We'd never done a hypertroph before. And let me say, putting this in humans is so much easier than putting it in cows. Why? Because we have transesophageal echo, we have better anesthesia, we get chest x-rays on them every day, we have ICU type care, they're not lying in their own poop, hopefully. This patient, they actually, in hubris, closed his chest at the end of the operation. We dictate that you should wait till the next day. They had to open it up emergently later that night. But still, he was extubated on postoperative day 1, was walking a mile a day. We have a video of him in street clothes carrying his own controller, waiting in line at McDonald's and buying an Egg McMuffin. I mean, and he said, my worst day in the last 2 weeks has been better than I have felt in the last decade. So anyway, unfortunately, he got transplanted at day 16, had primary graft dysfunction. We had to leave the OR with an open chest on ECMO. He spent four days on ECMO, 5 days with an open chest. We got him off ECMO. His chest is closed. He's extubated, but he's still on dialysis because the ECMO bumped off his kidneys, but he's undergoing physical therapy. He's going to make it out. But Bivacor went flawlessly. He did great. It's a transplant that almost caught him. And then patient 5 is getting transplanted right now at Texas Heart Institute. He was done November 1st, last Friday, delayed chest closure. He's just done great. And the only reason they're doing him so early and not letting him go longer is we found a 19-year-old donor who was 6 feet tall, who was 1 state over and super convenient. They said, if we wait for another heart like this, we'll have to wait months. And he's in great shape. His legs went from this to this. His liver was so congested, we thought he had cirrhosis. We did a jugular biopsy pre-op. It turned out it was this congestive hepatopathy. That resolved after 2 days. His creatinine went from 2 to 0.7. I mean, and it's because not only are we providing flow, but the CVP is low, the transcapillary gradients are nothing like we've ever seen in mechanical circulatory support. It's so exciting for me to see this, what this looks like in a patient. And this guy's lungs were terrible. They cleared up in a day because we ran his left atrial pressure at 3. And here's a, let's see.
180.
Anyway, that's a guy walking. I should show you that video because he's walking so quickly. But here's the 27-day implant. That's what it looked like when we cut out the atria to do the heart transplant. We put a camera down every pump to look and see what the inside of the pump looks like after just a single saline rinse. Here's the inside of his pump. We don't think these patients probably even need to be on Coumadin. So here's our first patient at home. This is with the board of Vivacor and some of the critical care docs and surgeons that took care of him. Here he is out enjoying some champagne. So in conclusion, we do have a long way to go, but we've done our first 5 patients. Our EFS was for 5. We just applied to do patients 6 through 15 with a new drive line, so they will be able to go home. So they won't be status 1, they'll be status 2. And since we've seen the longer you have it, the better a transplant candidate you are. These patients just can't stay in the ICU. They go crazy. So hopefully we'll get the nod to do those EFS, additional EFSs, and we'll be able to send them home. While FDA is opining on that, we're going to Australia in 2 weeks, and we've got 2 patients set up at St. Vincent's in Sydney. Ultimately, our ambition is to be, instead of a transplant, not a bridge to transplant. And from what I've seen so far, that's going to be a reality. Continuous flow pumps are very well suited for heart replacement. Leaving the heart in the chest is a liability. That's why LVADs have only touched a small percentage of the market that needs them. When you leave the diseased heart there, thrombus forms around the inlet cannula, maybe in the left atrial appendage. That's why we have pump thromboses and strokes. More importantly, though, their right ventricles are not normal. We say they're normal. We put an LVAD in, and suddenly the right ventricle has to work. A third definitely are in RV failure, despite their heartmate 3, but all of them have some right heart dysfunction. None of them can exert. There's a test called the 6-minute walk. About 2/3 of patients can walk 400 meters at 4 months with a heartmate 3. 1/3 of them can't, and that's associated with bad long-term outcomes. Our patients are doing that on day 8 because of low right atrial pressure, low CVP. So we think this is a paradigm shift that's not just going to be total artificial heart. It's not just going to be transplant. We think this is going to be the mechanical replacement for the failing human heart that changes heart failure. If Vivacor is not the device, it'll be something like that. Nobody flew anywhere on the right flyer. I think we've compellingly shown the world that a continuous flow double-sided impeller is the way to do it. Pretty soon, everybody's going to start working on this, and some of them will be smarter and harder working than us. I know that sounds crazy, but anyway, the future of our field is going to be an artificial heart with a double-sided impeller. And I wanted to show you one last slide. I'm right at the top of the hour, but I told you about the big feud between Michael DeBakey and Denton Cooley, and them not talking for 4 decades. Well, Bud Frazier and I both trained with DeBakey. I was his last chief resident. Bud did general surgery there. I did cardiac with DeBakey. So we would go over at night and show him what we were working on with the twin turbines, because Dr. DeBakey died in 2008. But we'd show it to him, and he'd say, "Well, you see, it's satisfying seeing somebody work on this. I thought of this years ago." That's a hallmark of a good idea. Everybody takes credit for it. But we would always invite him to come over to the Texas Heart Institute, the red ant over to the black anthill, and he never did it. Well, one day, Bud went over the night before we were going to do a cow. and said, "Oh, I think Dr. DeBakey's going to be coming over today." I said, "Yeah, he's not gonna." Well, I'm getting the animal ready, the cow ready, and the phone rings, and it's George Noon, one of DeBakey's lieutenants. He says, "Hey, Billy, this is George. Dr. DeBakey's coming over in the tunnel." I go, "No way," because all the hospitals are connected by tunnels. So I call Bud Frazier. He goes, "Yeah, I said he might. I better call the chief." He calls Denton Cooley. We take this picture. Here's Matthias Loby, a German heart surgeon who had been at Methodist. Here's me putting the device in. Here's Bud Frazier getting in my way. There's George Noon. There's Michael DeBakey and Denton Cooley hanging out like best buds. First time they've been in each other's presence in 40 years. Subsequently, DeBakey got the Congressional Gold Medal. He invited Denton Cooley to go with him to receive it. Cooley joined the DeBakey Society. DeBakey joined the Cooley Society. Kumbaya. So not only do these continuous flow artificial hearts have the potential to cure all the challenges with heart disease and heart failure, but they can mend severely fractured relationships. That's all I've got. Thank you for your attention.